They are two stars now that will always lead us forward. Thank you.
Yoselyn Ortega, New York City, New York. There is a particular kind of trust that develops when a family hires a live-in caregiver. It is not the trust between two strangers. It is something more intimate than that, forged over months of shared morning routines, school pickups, Sunday afternoons, and the thousand small moments that accumulate into a life. To the outside world, Marina and Kevin Krim were living the New York City dream, a sprawling apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Successful careers. 3 bright, beautiful children. 6-year-old Lucia, known to everyone who loved her as Lulu, 2-year-old Leo, and 3-year-old Nessie. To help manage the rhythm of their lives, they had hired a woman they believed they knew well. 50-year-old Yoselyn Ortega, originally from the Dominican Republic, had been working in their home for 2 years. She was quiet, reliable. The children seemed genuinely comfortable with her. The Krims treated her not as an employee, but as a member of the household, paying for her flights home to visit her family, bringing her along on a family vacation. They had no reason to believe she was anything other than what she appeared to be. They had no idea that behind that composed, familiar face, a slow fire of resentment had been burning for months. The afternoon of October 25, 2012. Marina Krim had taken her middle child, Nessie, to a swimming lesson. The plan was straightforward. Ortega would bring Lulu and Leo to meet them at the pool. When they didn't arrive, Marina sent a text. No reply. The unease that settled in her stomach in those moments, the particular dread of a parent whose instincts have fired without a clear reason, was unlike anything she had felt before. She returned to the apartment. The building was silent in the way that buildings never are when children are inside. She took the elevator up. She called their names in the hallway. Nothing. She moved through the dark rooms. And then she noticed it. A thin line of light beneath the master bathroom door. What Marina Krim found when she opened that door was a scene so devastating, so utterly beyond the reach of any preparation, that it entered the public consciousness as one of the defining tragedies of its decade. The white bathroom was saturated in blood. In the bathtub lay the small, still bodies of Lulu and Leo. Both had been stabbed, not once, not twice, but multiple times, with a kind of force that investigators later described as savage and sustained. Lulu, who was 6 years old and fully conscious when the attack began, had fought back. Her small hands bore defensive wounds. Leo's injuries were catastrophic. Standing above them, a blood-soaked kitchen knife in her hand, was Yoselyn Ortega. As Marina watched, in a state that transcends shock, that exists beyond the language of horror, Ortega turned the knife on herself, driving it into her own throat. The scream that erupted from Marina Krim in that moment was described by neighbors as not sounding entirely human. It was the sound of a person whose world had been permanently destroyed. The investigation that followed revealed a motive as chilling as the crime itself. This was not a sudden psychotic episode. It was the end point of a long, festering resentment that Ortega had been cultivating in silence for months. Her own life was falling apart. She was drowning in financial problems. She had recently been forced to move her adult son out of their apartment and back into her sister's cramped home in the Bronx. And every single day, she walked from that reality into the Krim family's world of affluence, warmth, and apparent ease. She grew to despise what she saw. She was jealous of Marina, of what she perceived as a perfect life, a perfect mother, a perfect home. She complained to family members that the Krims overworked her, that they asked her to perform household duties beyond the scope of a nanny. In her own account, the children, Lulu and Leo, who by all accounts adored her, had become symbols of a life she believed she had been denied. So she decided to take them from the person she blamed for the contrast. At her trial, Ortega's defense argued legal insanity, that she had been suffering from severe psychosis, hearing voices commanding her to kill. The prosecution rejected that framing entirely. They argued that this was a deliberate, calculated act of revenge executed by a woman consumed by hatred. The forensic evidence supported them. The brutality of the attack, the defensive wounds on Lulu's hands, the depth of Leo's injuries, was not consistent with a detached state. It was consistent with fury. In 2018, after a 6-week trial, the jury convicted Yoselyn Ortega of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to the maximum, life in prison without the possibility of parole. "You are pure evil," he told her from the bench. As of the date of this documentary, Ortega is incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, where she will die. In the aftermath, Marina and Kevin Krim did something that most people in their position would have found impossible. They founded the Lulu and Leo Fund, a charity that promotes creativity and arts education for children, ensuring that their children's names are carried forward in association with the light they brought into the world, rather than the darkness that took them out of it. Before we continue, welcome to Daily Crime Archive. Every documentary we produce is drawn entirely from verified court records and accredited news sources. No speculation, no exaggeration, just the documented truth of some of the most disturbing cases in criminal history. If that kind of content is what you're looking for, subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it keeps this archive growing. Now, let's continue.
Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Guilty of what?
Guilty of murder in the 2nd degree.
Why did they do that to me? Why did they do that to me?
Louise Woodward, Newton, Massachusetts. Not every case in this archive ends with a verdict that satisfies. Some end with questions that remain permanently open. Questions about evidence, about science, about the capacity of a legal system to arrive at the truth when the truth is genuinely contested. The case of Louise Woodward is perhaps the most discussed, most debated, and most unresolved case of caregiver violence in the history of American law. It is a story about a dead infant, a 19-year-old girl, and a courtroom that became the battlefield for a transatlantic war. In 1996, Sunil and Deborah Epen, 2 respected physicians living in the Boston suburb of Newton, Massachusetts, hired Louise Woodward as an au pair. Woodward was 19 years old, fresh from a small town in England, looking for a year of experience and cultural exchange in America. To the Epens, she seemed ideal, bright, cheerful, responsible. They introduced her to their household, which included their elder son Brendan and their 8-month-old baby Matthew. The arrangement lasted less than a year before it collapsed in the worst possible way. February 4, 1997. Louise Woodward called 911. The baby in her care, Matthew Epen, was gasping for air and had gone limp. Paramedics arrived to find an unresponsive infant, his breathing shallow and labored. He was rushed to Boston Children's Hospital, where medical staff discovered a constellation of injuries that stopped the doctors cold: a massive skull fracture, severe bleeding in the brain, and extensive retinal hemorrhaging. To the medical experts who examined him, these were the hallmark injuries of shaken baby syndrome, a pattern of trauma that, in 1997, was understood to indicate that a child had been violently shaken and then slammed against a hard surface with significant force. Matthew Epen died of his injuries, and the only person who had been with him when it happened was his au pair. Louise Woodward was arrested and charged with murder. What followed was not simply a criminal trial. It became a transatlantic media war. In the United States, she was cast as a cold and callous teenager who had killed an infant out of frustration and immaturity. In England, she was embraced as a naive young woman, being railroaded by an aggressive and flawed American system. British tabloids ran campaigns to free her. Her family and supporters raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for her defense. The courtroom became a stage for something far larger than the facts of one case. The scientific testimony was genuinely contradictory. The prosecution's experts argued that Matthew's injuries were fresh and could only have been caused by immense, deliberate force. The defense's experts presented a competing theory, that the injury involved a pre-existing blood clot, possibly weeks old, that had rebled spontaneously on the day in question. These were not fringe opinions. They came from credentialed, respected physicians who disagreed in good faith. Woodward's own account was troubled from the start. Her initial statements to police were inconsistent. She eventually admitted she may have been a little rough with Matthew, that she had popped him on the bed, that he may have hit his head. Prosecutors treated this as a confession. Defense attorneys called it the confused language of a frightened teenager, trying to reconstruct events she didn't fully understand. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of second-degree murder, a conviction carrying a mandatory life sentence. The image broadcast across the world was of a 19-year-old girl collapsing in the courtroom, sobbing, "Why did they do that to me?" In England, the reaction was outrage. In the United States, many felt justice had been served for a dead child. Then came the intervention that made this case legally historic. 10 days after the verdict, Judge Hiller Zobel did something extraordinarily rare. He threw out the jury's murder conviction. In a written ruling, he determined that the circumstances in which the defendant acted were characterized by confusion, inexperience, frustration, immaturity, and some anger, but not malice. He reduced the charge to involuntary manslaughter and sentenced Woodward to the 279 days she had already served behind bars. She walked free. As of the date of this documentary, Louise Woodward is in her late 40s. She returned to England after her release, completed a law degree, became a mother, and teaches dance in a small town. She has always maintained her absolute innocence in the death of Matthew Eapen. The Eapen family has always maintained that she is a killer who was never made to fully answer for what she did. Matthew Eapen was 8 months old. He never had a chance to take his first steps. That fact, whatever the legal verdict says, is the one that does not change. Moscow, Russia. There are cases in this archive that disturb because of their calculated cruelty. There are cases that disturb because of their sheer violence. And then there are cases that disturb in a different way. Cases where the horror is inseparable from a complete collapse of reality, where the mind of the perpetrator had shattered so completely that the act committed cannot be explained by any framework of rational motivation. The case of Gyulchekhra Bobokulova is, by any measure, one of the most disturbing cases of caregiver violence in the 21st century. The Mishcheryakov family in Moscow had a 4-year-old daughter, Nastya, who required a level of care that went beyond what most parents can provide alone. Nastya had cerebral palsy and epilepsy, conditions that demanded constant, dedicated attention from someone both compassionate and skilled. They found Gyulchekhra Bobokulova, a 38-year-old woman who had immigrated from Uzbekistan. For 3 years, Bobokulova worked in their home. The family saw nothing unusual. She was professional, attentive. The child seemed comfortable with her. They trusted her completely. What they did not know, what she had hidden from them, was that Bobokulova had a documented diagnosis of schizophrenia stretching back years in Uzbekistan. And more than that, in the months leading up to February 2016, her already fractured mental state had been further destabilized by a relationship with a man reportedly involved in extremist ideology, who had filled the spaces of her deteriorating mind with radical religious content. She was not a trained terrorist. She was a profoundly unwell woman, whose delusions had been twisted and weaponized. February 29, 2016. Moscow. The Mishcheryakov parents left for work that morning as they always did, leaving Nastya in Bobokulova's care. Hours later, the call came. Their apartment building was on fire. When emergency crews arrived, they found the apartment gutted by flames. But the fire itself was not the worst of what they found. Inside the apartment, on the floor, was the headless body of a 4-year-old child. The horror did not stay confined to that apartment. Outside the Oktyabrskoye Pole metro station, police were receiving frantic reports about a woman in a black hijab screaming in the street. Officers responded expecting a person in psychological distress. What they found was something that witnesses described as existing entirely outside any reference point they had ever encountered. Bobokulova was in the street. She was screaming, and in her raised hand she was holding the severed head of Nastya Mishcheryakova. For the next hour, in a scene captured on dozens of cell phones and broadcast globally within hours. She stood in front of the metro station holding the child's head aloft like a grotesque trophy. She screamed religious declarations. She told the crowd she was their death. She threatened to detonate a bomb. She paced and turned and screamed, commanding a public square into paralyzed silence. The image, a woman in black, holding the head of the disabled 4-year-old she had been paid to protect, became one of the most shocking single images of criminal violence in modern Russian history. It was not just a murder, it was a performance. It was theater, and she was the only actor. When investigators examined her motive, they found the intersection of catastrophic mental illness and radicalized ideology. Bobokulova told authorities that she had killed Nastya as an act of revenge for Russian airstrikes in Syria. She said Allah had commanded her to do it. The investigators and court-appointed psychiatrists who evaluated her subsequently reached a conclusion, supported by the totality of the evidence. Bobokulova was a paranoid schizophrenic who had not been in control of her own mind at the time of the murder. Her delusions were real to her. She had not been feigning illness. The Russian court found her legally insane and committed her to an indefinite high-security psychiatric facility rather than a prison sentence. As of the date of this documentary, she remains confined in a secure psychiatric institution. Her doctors report that her condition has been stabilized with medication. The prospect of her release is considered virtually non-existent. Nastya Meshcheryakova was 4 years old. She had cerebral palsy and epilepsy. She could not run. She could not hide. She had no ability to protect herself from the woman her parents had trusted with her life for 3 years. We are about a third of the way through tonight's archive. 10 cases. Verified sources. No filler. If this is the kind of documentary content you want more of, subscribing to Daily Crime Archive is the single most effective way to support what we're building here. Now, back to the record. Olivia Riner, Pound Ridge, New York. There is a psychological disorder that clinicians call hero syndrome, sometimes referred to as Munchausen syndrome, or, in its more extreme iterations, Munchausen by proxy. It is, at its core, a hunger. A craving for attention so acute, so consuming, that the individual afflicted by it will manufacture a crisis specifically to place themselves at the center of it. They want to be the person who discovers the fire, the person who sounds the alarm, the person the community embraces and mourns alongside. In most documented cases, this disorder manifests as fabricated illness, staged accidents, or small-scale emergencies. In the case of Olivia Riner, it manifested as the suffocation of a 6-week-old infant and the burning of her employer's home. In the affluent New York suburb of Pound Ridge, William and Denise Fisher were new parents. Their daughter Christy was 6 weeks old. They needed help, and they found it in the form of Olivia Riner, a 20-year-old au pair from Switzerland who came with impeccable references and carried herself with the calm professional confidence of someone significantly older. The Fishers felt immediately at ease with her. She was, by every outward measure, exactly what they needed. They had no idea they had welcomed a serial arsonist into their home. December 2, 1991. The Fishers were out for the evening. A 911 call reported a fire at the Fisher residence. Neighbors who came outside found flames pouring from the house. And then, out of the smoke, staggering and hysterical, emerged Olivia Riner. Her face was stained with soot. Her voice was broken with panic. She told anyone who would listen that she had tried, desperately, repeatedly, to get to baby Christy's room. But the smoke had been too thick, the fire too intense. She had been forced to flee without the child. In the immediate aftermath, Riner was treated as a victim, a young woman who had barely escaped with her own life, while the infant in her care did not. The community embraced her. They called her brave. No one thought to look more closely. The medical examiner did. When forensic investigators examined Christy Fisher's body, they found something that dismantled the entire narrative of a tragic house fire. There was almost no soot in the baby's lungs. There was no carbon monoxide in her blood. The medical examiner's conclusion was absolute. Christy Fisher had been dead for up to 30 minutes before the fire was set. She had not died in the fire. She had been suffocated. and then the fire had been lit around her body to conceal the murder. The investigation that followed took detectives across the Atlantic. In Switzerland, they uncovered a pattern that had been visible for years to anyone who had thought to look for it. Olivia Riner had previously worked as a nanny in at least 4 other households. In each of those households, a suspicious fire had occurred. She had been the person who discovered every one of them. She had been treated each time as an unfortunate victim of circumstance. The pattern was now undeniable. She was not a victim. She was the architect. The prosecution argued at trial that Reiner suffered from a dangerous hero complex, that her entire identity was built around being the central figure in a tragedy. She had spent years setting fires and then discovering them, feeding the hunger with the attention and sympathy that followed. But at some point, the fires alone were no longer enough. The performance needed to escalate. And so, on the night of December 2nd, 1991, she killed the 6-week-old infant in her care and set the house on fire, positioning herself as the devastated survivor at the center of the most dramatic scene she had yet created. Throughout the trial, Reiner maintained an unnerving calm. Witnesses described her as blank, emotionless, watching the proceedings with the detached expression of someone observing a performance that no longer concerned them. The jury convicted her of second-degree murder and second-degree arson in 1993. The judge sentenced her to the maximum, 25 years to life. As of the date of this documentary, Olivia Riner remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, the same institution that holds Yoselyn Ortega. She has been denied parole on multiple occasions, the board citing her continued lack of remorse and the cold, premeditated nature of her crime. Christine Falling. Central Florida. In the small towns of Central Florida in the early 1980s, Christine Falling was a familiar presence. She was young, simple-minded, and by most accounts deeply pitiable. A young woman who had suffered from epilepsy and developmental disabilities since childhood, who came across as childlike and helpless, and who seemed to need protection from the world rather than to pose any threat to it. When local families hired her to babysit, they were partly motivated by charity. They thought they were doing her a favor. They were not. Christine Falling was, beneath the facade of helplessness, a compulsive and methodical killer of children. Her preferred method was what she called, in her own confession, blanket magic, waiting until she was alone with the child, then pressing their face into a soft surface, a blanket, a pillow, and holding it there until they stopped breathing. It left no bruises, no defensive wounds, no obvious evidence of violence. It mimicked perfectly the tragic and medically mysterious phenomenon of sudden infant death syndrome, and for 2 years it worked. The pattern of death began in 1980. On her very first day babysitting 2-year-old Cassidy Johnson in the town of Blountstown, the child died. Falling gave a tearful, disjointed account of how the little girl had simply stopped breathing. In the absence of obvious foul play, and, it must be said, influenced by a reluctance to suspect a cognitively impaired young woman, doctors ruled the death an accident consistent with blunt head trauma, as if from a fall. 3 months later, 4-year-old Jeffrey Davis died in Falling's care in nearby Lakeland. Again, she played the devastated babysitter. Again, doctors found a plausible medical explanation. This time, myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart. 2 children dead in 3 months. The same caregiver both times. It should have been an unmistakable alarm. It was not. In 1981, 2-year-old Joseph Spring, Falling's own cousin, died after she had taken him to the doctor for a viral infection. Months later, 8-month-old William Swindle died in his crib while she was babysitting. With each death, her performance of grief grew more polished. Her story of being the world's most unlucky babysitter grew more practiced. A dark nickname began circulating in the community, the Killer Babysitter. But even as the whispers grew louder, no formal investigation materialized. The simplicity of her facade, the pity she inspired, and the absence of any visible forensic evidence continued to protect her. Her final murder broke the pattern that had shielded her. In July 1982, 10-week-old Travis Coleman died while in her care. This time, the autopsy was conducted by a medical examiner who was specifically aware of the rumors surrounding Falling. He examined the body more thoroughly than his predecessors. He found it. Tiny, precise hemorrhages in the tissue, the kind that can only be caused by deliberate, sustained smothering. This was not SIDS. This was homicide. Under interrogation, confronted with evidence she could not explain away, Falling confessed. She admitted to the murders of Travis Coleman, Joseph Spring, and Cassidy Johnson. She described her motive with a candor that investigators found both clarifying and deeply disturbing. She told them she had an uncontrollable urge to silence children whenever they cried or became fussy. She also admitted to something more narcissistic. She craved the sympathy and attention she received whenever a child died in her care. The grief of the families around her made her feel important, in a way she experienced almost nowhere else. Facing the death penalty, Falling pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. She received a life sentence. As of the date of this documentary, Christine Falling remains incarcerated at the Florida Women's Reception Center. She has been eligible for parole since 2006. At every single hearing, the families of her victims have appeared before the board to ensure she is denied it. So far they have been heard. Diane Odell, Newburgh, New York. The home daycare is, for many working parents, the ideal arrangement. A small, intimate, home-based setting, run by an experienced provider, someone with the warmth of a grandmother and the reliability of a professional. The children attend in small numbers. The environment feels safe. The caregiver is known, vetted, trusted. For the dozens of families in Newburgh, New York, who used Diane Odell's daycare throughout the 1980s, this was exactly what they believed they had found. They were wrong. Diane Odell was a serial predator who used the home daycare model as a hunting ground. Her method was identical to Christine Falling's, smothering infants while they slept, mimicking sudden infant death syndrome, and positioning herself as the heartbroken caregiver who had discovered the tragedy. The difference between Odell and Falling was not the method or the motive. It was the institutional trust she had built over years. Odell had a reputation. She had longevity. She had the social armor of a woman with a clean record, and a community full of parents who spoke well of her. It took a single determined investigator to begin pulling at the thread. The death of 3-month-old Andrew Lavister in 1985. Odell's account was routine by now. She had put the baby down for a nap and found him unresponsive when she checked on him. The cause of death was initially recorded as SIDS, but one investigator, alert to whispers and anomalies that others had dismissed, refused to accept that lightning could strike so many times in the same building. He began constructing a timeline. What he found was a history of death and near-death that formed a clear, damning pattern. Another infant, 4-month-old Peter, had also died of attributed SIDS while in Odell's care years earlier. Beyond the deaths, there were documented incidents of children suffering sudden, unexplained episodes of apnea in her care, simply stopping breathing without medical cause, only to be revived, often with Odell playing the role of the life-saving hero who had caught it in time. Those children had survived, but the pattern of their near deaths was clinically identical to the deaths of those who had not. The investigators' theory, subsequently supported by medical experts at trial, was that Odell was operating on a dark feedback loop rooted in Munchausen syndrome by proxy. She would smother an infant to the edge of death, then revive them, casting herself in the role of the vigilant caregiver who had saved a child's life. The drama, the attention, the sympathy, the admiration, these were her reward. On the occasions when she held on too long, when the child passed the point of revival, she pivoted to grief. And because SIDS was a recognized and medically accepted phenomenon in the 1980s, her grief was taken at face value. The prosecution's landmark argument at her 1987 trial was statistical. The odds of multiple SIDS deaths occurring under the care of a single, unrelated individual over a defined period were not merely improbable. They were essentially impossible. The jury accepted that argument. Diane Odell was convicted of murder. As of the date of this documentary, Odell is in her 70s and remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. She has been denied parole multiple times, the board consistently citing her absolute refusal to take any responsibility for the deaths of the children in her care. 6 cases documented. 4 more to go. If you've been watching since the beginning of this archive, thank you. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it. Every subscription tells us to keep building this channel. Back to the record. Lorie Conley, Reynoldsburg, Ohio. Not every killer in this archive is driven by obsession, ideology, or a clinical disorder. Some cases are disturbing precisely because of how ordinary their motive is, because the murder they describe is the product of nothing more complex or extraordinary than selfishness. The case of Lorie Conley is one of those cases. It is not the story of a monster with a profound sickness. It is the story of a grown woman who decided, in a conscious, unambiguous moment of choice, that an infant's life was worth less than a quiet afternoon. In Reynoldsburg, Ohio, the Moley family trusted Lorie Conley not because she was an agency hire, but because she was a friend. A familiar face in their social circle. A woman they had known long enough to feel comfortable calling reliable. She had babysat their 8-month-old son Hayden on multiple occasions without incident. The arrangement was casual, built on the informal confidence of a long-standing relationship. There was no contract, no formal vetting, no background check. There was simply the assumption, the reasonable human assumption, that someone who had been in your life for a meaningful period of time was not a threat to your child. May 2016. Hayden Moley's mother dropped him off at Conley's house in the morning and expected to collect him in the evening. Instead, she received the call that ends worlds. Conley was hysterical. She had put Hayden down for a nap, she said. When she checked on him, he was cold. Blue. Not breathing. The baby was rushed to the hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival. In the immediate aftermath, Conley played the grief-stricken friend. She cried alongside the family. She offered comfort to the very parents whose son she had killed. For weeks, the family mourned what they believed was a sudden, inexplicable tragedy, a natural death, a medical mystery. Conley mourned with them. Then the toxicology report came back. The medical examiner found diphenhydramine in Hayden's system, the active ingredient in the common antihistamine and sleep aid, sold under the brand name Benadryl. The concentration was not a trace amount. It was not the residue of a child accidentally exposed to a small dose. It was a massive lethal quantity, a dose that would have been heavy for an adult. For an 8-month-old infant, it was a death sentence. This was not SIDS. This was a poisoning, and the only person who had been with Hayden Moley that day was Lorie Conley. When police confronted her with the toxicology report, her story collapsed. She confessed. She had given Hayden an adult dose of Benadryl. Her reason, the reason she provided investigators, the reason she stood by throughout her trial, the reason that made the prosecutors in the case describe their reaction as being beyond outrage, was this. She wanted him to go to sleep. She wanted some peace and quiet. The baby had been fussy. She had wanted to relax. And so she had reached into the medicine cabinet and administered a fatal overdose to a child to remove the inconvenience of his existence for the afternoon. This was not an accident. This was not a miscalculation. This was a choice. A conscious, deliberate decision to drug an infant, made by a grown woman, who was herself a mother, who was fully aware that adult medications are not safe for infants, and who decided that her comfort was worth more than his life. The jury agreed with the prosecution's characterization. In 2017, Lorie Conley was convicted of murder. She received a life sentence, but remains eligible for parole after serving 15 years. The Moley family attends every parole hearing to fight that possibility. Megan Martens, Fresno, California. There is a reason we ask, when considering a caregiver, not just whether they are experienced or responsible, but whether they are patient. Patience is not a luxury in the care of small children. It is a fundamental requirement. A child cries. A toddler resists. A baby refuses to sleep. These are not provocations. They are the ordinary conditions of a developmental stage that demands tolerance from every adult around it. The caregiver who cannot provide that tolerance, whose emotional resources are thin enough to be exhausted by the ordinary demands of an 18-month-old, represents a specific and serious danger. In Fresno, California, Megan Martens was a trusted babysitter within her social circle. The parents of 18-month-old Jaden Rose knew her. They had used her services before, without concern. She was friendly, capable, and gave every indication of being someone they could leave their son with safely. What they could not see, what her exterior gave no indication of, was a temper of genuinely dangerous volatility, a reservoir of rage that existed entirely beneath the surface of her ordinary presentation. The day the Roses trusted her with Jaden. When they returned that evening, they found their son limp and unresponsive. His body had visible bruising. There was a swelling on his head that made his father's knees give out. Martens was already trying to explain. She offered a story about a small fall from a child-sized couch. When the severity of the injuries made that impossible to accept, she revised. She had accidentally dropped him in the kitchen. When that didn't hold, she added a new element. Another child in her care had pushed him. The story shifted with a desperation that was itself evidence. Every new version was designed to absorb the facts that had made the previous version collapse. By the time they reached the hospital, Martens had offered 3 separate accounts of how Jaden had been injured. At the hospital, doctors examined the child with the care and precision of people who have seen violence against children before and know exactly what it looks like. What they found was catastrophic: multiple skull fractures, massive brain swelling, and internal bleeding. These were not injuries consistent with a household fall of any description. They were injuries consistent with sustained, deliberate, violent force. Jaden Rose was declared brain dead. He died shortly after. Under interrogation, Martens confessed. There had been no fall, no other child, no accident. Jaden had been fussy. He would not stop crying. And Megan Martens, whose patience had run out, whose emotional regulation had failed her entirely, had snapped. She admitted to violently shaking him. Then, in a state of rage that she described as blinding, she had slammed his head against the floor. Not once, multiple times. An 18-month-old child, slammed against the floor because he was crying. The prosecution at her trial presented the evidence as a case study in what happens when an adult with an unacknowledged rage problem is placed in a caregiving role for which they are catastrophically unsuited. The medical evidence demonstrated the extreme force involved. Her own lies, the shifting stories, the frantic invention of accidents, demonstrated her full awareness of her guilt. In 2015, Megan Martens was convicted of second-degree murder and felony child abuse. She was sentenced to 25 years to life and will not be eligible for parole until the full 25 years have been served. As of the date of this documentary, she is incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Melissa Haskell, Waltham, Massachusetts. Most caregivers who commit violence do so in a moment. They snap. They act. They may or may not have the capacity to understand the full nature of what they are doing in that instant. The moment is terrible, but it is still a moment, an eruption from a specific pressure point that, under different circumstances, might never have been reached. The case of Melissa Haskell is different. Melissa Haskell was not a person who snapped. She was a person who had already demonstrated, years before she was ever left alone with a helpless infant, that her response to inconvenience and frustration was to arrange for someone's death. In the Boston suburb of Waltham, Massachusetts, the Needham family hired 22-year-old Melissa Haskell to babysit their 5-month-old son Michael. She came across as sweet and reliable. They had done what they believed were the right checks. Nothing in her presentation suggested anything other than a capable young woman. What they did not know, what a background check had either not uncovered or not been specific enough to surface, was that Melissa Haskell had, as a teenager, been convicted of soliciting to commit murder. The facts of that prior conviction are as extraordinary as they sound. As a teenager, Haskell had become obsessed with an ex-boyfriend. When he began seeing someone new, she had approached a high school classmate with a specific proposal. She wanted to hire them to kill the new girlfriend. She offered $500. The classmate went to the police. Haskell was arrested, tried, and convicted. She was, in other words, a person with a documented history of treating murder as a solution to personal frustration before she was ever left alone with the Needham baby. February 1991. Waltham, Massachusetts. Haskell made a 911 call. Baby Michael had been put down for a nap. When she checked on him, he was blue and unresponsive. She told paramedics he must have choked on his formula. He was rushed to the hospital. He did not survive. For a brief period, Haskell performed the role of the traumatized babysitter. She was hysterical. She was inconsolable. She offered the Needham family her grief, alongside her fabricated innocence. The autopsy dismantled her story with clinical precision. There was no formula in Michael Needham's lungs. There was no evidence of choking. What the medical examiner found instead were signs of compression on his face and chest, and a cause of death that was unambiguous: asphyxiation. The baby had been forcibly smothered. When police ran Haskell's background and discovered her prior conviction for soliciting murder, the entire picture came into focus. This was not a young woman who had panicked. This was not an inexperienced caregiver who had made a fatal mistake. This was a person who had already tried to have someone killed when they became an inconvenience, and who, when faced with a fussy, crying infant she did not want to manage, had resolved the inconvenience in the only way that, for her, had ever made sense. At trial, the prosecution was permitted to introduce her prior conviction as evidence, a decision that proved decisive. The jury was presented with the full picture, not just what she had done to Michael Needham, but who she had shown herself to be years before she ever walked through the Needham family's front door. In 1992, they found her guilty of first-degree murder. As of the date of this documentary, Melissa Haskell is in her 50s and is incarcerated at MCI Framingham in Massachusetts. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will die there. Naperville, Illinois. Every case in this archive has involved a caregiver who turned their violence on the children entrusted to them. The motives have varied: jealousy, financial desperation, hunger for attention, clinical delusion, uncontrolled rage. But in every case so far, the children were, in some sense, the intended targets. The final case in tonight's archive is different. It is the most premeditated, the most calculated, and in many ways, the most chilling of all the cases we have covered, precisely because the children were not the true targets. They were instruments, weapons selected for their ability to inflict the maximum possible suffering on someone else. In the affluent Chicago suburb of Naperville, Illinois, 40-year-old Elzbieta Plackowska was, to all outward appearances, a stable presence in her community. A Polish immigrant, a stay-at-home mother, the wife of a long-haul trucker who was frequently away for extended periods. She regularly babysat for her neighbors, the Dworakowski family, and their 5-year-old daughter Olivia. She was a familiar face on the street. No one saw what was building beneath the surface. What was building was a marriage breaking apart in slow motion, or at least Plackowska's experience of it was. She felt abandoned. She felt undervalued. She felt that her husband, perpetually absent on the road, was indifferent to the pressure she managed alone. The resentment that grew from these feelings was not brief or passing. It was deep, corrosive, and compounding. And on the night of October 30th, 2012, it reached a breaking point. The Dworakowski home. October 30th, 2012. Plackowska was at the Dworakowski house, watching 5-year-old Olivia. Her own 7-year-old son, Justin, was there for a playdate. The two children were told to get ready for bed. Shortly afterward, Plackowska began making phone calls. She called her church, speaking incoherently to a priest about intruders and the devil's blood. She called her adult son and told him something terrible had happened. When police arrived at the Dworakowski home in response to a reported disturbance, what they walked into was a crime scene of almost incomprehensible violence. In the master bedroom, they found the bodies of Justin Plackowska and Olivia Dworakowski. Both children had been stabbed. Not once, not a few times, but dozens, and in some cases, hundreds of times. The ferocity of the attack shocked homicide detectives with decades of experience. The family's 2 pet dogs had also been killed. Plackowska was at the scene, covered in blood, with superficial self-inflicted wounds on her arms. Her story of an intruder dissolved within minutes of questioning. She confessed. Her motive, delivered in a confession that prosecutors called one of the most disturbing they had ever heard, was this: she was angry with her husband. She wanted to punish him. And the most devastating punishment she could conceive of was to destroy the thing he loved most. So she had killed their son. Yoselyn Plackowska was 7 years old. He was stabbed by his mother more than 100 times. Olivia Dworakowski was 5 years old. She had been in the wrong house on the wrong night. Plackowska stabbed her 50 times because the child had witnessed the first murder and could not be allowed to live. In her confession, Plackowska offered justifications. She said she killed her son because she didn't want him to grow up with a mother like her. She killed Olivia so that Justin would not be alone on his way to heaven. These were not the words of a person in a dissociative state. These were deliberate, post hoc rationalizations from someone who had made conscious decisions and was now trying to construct a narrative around them. The defense at trial argued insanity, that Plackowska had been suffering from severe depression, a family history of mental illness, and a recent traumatic loss, and that she had experienced a psychotic break. The prosecution countered with a single statement she had made to her husband during a phone argument earlier that same day: "You have your fun now. I will have mine." The jury rejected the insanity defense in 2017. Elzbieta Plackowska was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to natural life in prison. As of the date of this documentary, she is incarcerated at the Logan Correctional Center in Illinois. She will die there. 10 cases. 10 documented verdicts. What unites all 10 is not a single motive or a single psychological profile. The cases in tonight's archive were committed by women driven by jealousy, by hunger for attention, by ideological delusion, by laziness, by rage, and by a desire for revenge, so absolute it consumed 2 children who had nothing to do with the conflict that produced it. What the cases do share is this: in every instance, a family made a decision to trust. They extended that trust to a person they had vetted, in some cases to a person they had known for years. They handed over what was most irreplaceable to them. And in every case, that trust was not simply broken, it was used against them. The children in these cases, Lulu and Leo Krim, Matthew Epen, Nastya Meshcheryakova, Christy Fisher, Cassidy Johnson and Travis Coleman, and the others, in Christine Fallen's wake, the infants in Diane Odell's daycare, Aiden Moley, Jaden Rose, Michael Needham, Yoselyn Plackowska, and Olivia Dworakowski, they were not abstractions. They were specific people at the earliest stages of becoming themselves. They deserved better from the adults around them. This archive exists to ensure their cases are remembered, documented, and never reduced to a number. That is tonight's archive. 90 minutes. 10 cases, every one of them drawn from verified court records and documented reporting. If this is the kind of content you want to see more of, cases researched properly, presented without exploitation, subscribing to Daily Crime Archive makes that possible. We will see you in the next one.